from the first question. Stands in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why did he flag labour market reforms as a way to protect New Zealand against global volatility instead of flagging upskilling New Zealanders and introducing a tax regime that does not load investment incentives in favour of property rather than the productive and export sectors?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, because I was only asked about labour market reforms, but in relation to those other matters, the government has changed the tax system to more heavily tax property relative to other investments. In Budget 2010, we increased the effective tax on property around investment by around $1 billion a year. And we are upskilling New Zealanders. The government will be funding around 13,000 more core tertiary places across all sectors in 2012 than we were in 2008.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, why is it smart to cut KiwiSaver and to introduce labour market changes that cut wages and conditions in New Zealand when in the last 2 months a record number of New Zealanders, the highest ever, have fled New Zealand to Australia because superannuation benefits and wages are higher in that country?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Oh, Mr Speaker, I think the member makes an interesting point about superannuation. In Australia, the payments are actually made by companies. They're 9% and they're on their way to 13%. What the government did in Budget 2011 was to reflect the fact that actually the government couldn't afford to be the major contributor to KiwiSaver on an ongoing basis, and actually at that point, $1 and $2 in KiwiSaver accounts had been contributed by the government, and quite simply we didn't want to run as much debt. And as we know from the financial markets in the last few weeks, running a lot of debt's not a very smart thing to do. We know Labor wants to run more debt, and that's what they'll do if they ever become the government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. When youth unemployment is at record proportions and there's a looming skills shortage crisis in New Zealand, why has his government cut $145 million from skill training in the budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I said, I think in my earlier answer, you were spending nearly $300 million more in terms of tertiary education in 2008 than 2012. But again, there is a difference between this government and I actually accept that difference. There is a difference between this government and the previous Labor government. You see, this government, when it gives taxpayers money for a particular project, expects to see results. And when the completion rates are so low that you're effectively wasting taxpayers' money, then in our view, you have to make changes.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question. What does he say to Major Campbell Roberts of the Salvation Army, who, in commenting on the sharp cuts that his government has just announced in their successful training programs, he says, quote, "There is a harsh irony when the political conversation emphasises the need to prepare beneficiaries for work, yet the training that equips these people to enter the workforce is being slowly killed off." End quote.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think we'd reject that. I mean, the government's putting more money in. We expect results from those training programs. And the other comment I'd make to Major Campbell Roberts, as I have on numerous occasions actually, is to say that this government takes its responsibilities to vulnerable New Zealanders very seriously, and that's why, through the depths of the global financial crisis, we actually continue to fund all sorts of payments, not the least of them being working for families.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, why has he cut the funding for training the Salvation Army job training programs when their work outcome and training outcome from those programs is at a very high level, over 65%?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't have the details on the specific Salvation Army, but if the member wants to either put that down to the appropriate minister or put it down as a written question, I'll give him an answer.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable John Boscawen.
Supplementary to the Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, given that he's just told the House that it's smart not to run too much debt at a time of financial crisis, why did his government wait until this year's budget to make the changes to KiwiSaver when they could have been made in two previous budgets?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, because the government addresses different themes in different budgets, and if you look at Budget 2010, that particular theme was about rebalancing the tax system. Now, I think we personally made some good changes there. We also came in, I think, in Budget, I may be wrong, but from memory, Budget 2009 actually would have reflected the changes to KiwiSaver that we'd campaigned on in 2008. So in that regard, in 2 of the 3 budgets, we have made changes. I personally think we've got KiwiSaver now onto a platform where it's enduring, where it is affordable, and where New Zealanders will participate.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, given the Prime Minister's statement of commitment to skills training, why has his government in the last couple of weeks, without consultation, imposed sharp cuts on the YMCA's successful job training program, which its CEO, Rick Odom, says puts the future viability of their programs at risk?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaking again, I'd say the same thing about that program as Salvation Army. I don't have those details to hand. If the member wants to put it down as a written question or put it down as a primary question, I'm sure we can do that, or give it to the appropriate minister. But I go back to the earlier point I made, which is the government is spending more money in this area and expects value for money.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when upskilling New Zealanders is a core to creating a stronger and more resilient New Zealand economy, why has his government in the last 2 years cut industry trainee numbers by nearly 31,000 and building and construction trainees by over 5,000, or almost a third, when there's a shortage in building trades?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, because some of those programs just simply weren't delivering results. There were a variety of reasons, and again, if the member wants to direct that question to the Minister of Tertiary Education, I'm sure with chapter and verse he can give that to you. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's worth making one point, and that is, yes, of course, skills training is critically important, just as education is, which is why the government's been committed to everything from national standards to improving the quality of teaching that we have in this country. But that is just one factor. I'll tell you the other things that make a difference to delivering jobs and growth in the economy, and that is a competitive tax system, not one that would have a top personal rate with a yawning great big gap with it, not one that would apply a capital gains tax to the productive sector in New Zealand.
I think we're departing a little now from the question.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when 77,000 young New Zealanders are not in work, education or training, which isn't funny, and there's a desperate skills shortage in New Zealand, why has he not introduced new programs to provide skill training for young people, particularly in the trades area, instead of simply relying on bringing people in from overseas while New Zealanders stay out of work?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, well, the member's just plain wrong. I mean, Youth Guarantee is one good example of that. I myself was in Christchurch some months ago. Announcing the increase in skills training there specific to the rebuild of Christchurch. What the government has done is said New Zealand taxpayers deserve value for money, and we're going to deliver them value for money by focusing on courses that actually have good outcomes. Well, you see, Labor want to run more debt. Labor want to waste taxpayers' dollars. That's what Labor does. Labor's got a PhD when it comes to education. Labor's got a PhD when it comes to waste. On this side of the House, we deliver results. That's the difference.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I seek the leave of the House to table a document prepared by the Parliamentary Library showing that $145.885 million has been cut out of skill training.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection.
Further point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table from the Tertiary Education Commission website entitled Performance Information, August 2011, the number of industry trainees that show that there's been a reduction of 31,000 in the last 2 years.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There's no objection. Question. Supplementary question, the Honourable Jim Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell the House how it reduces New Zealand's long-term national debt if you sell assets that are earning hundreds of millions of dollars a year in perpetuity for a one-off asset sale which only realises a limited amount of cash for the short term?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the member raises a good point. I mean, firstly, let's understand the facts. The government intends, if it's re-elected as the government, to purchase around about $33 billion of assets worth over the next 5 years. It'll be releasing capital in the order of $5 to $7 billion. So actually the Crown balance sheet will rise. Secondly, if one looks at the dividend stream that you get from the current SOEs, it's about equal to the funding cost of those SOEs. Thirdly, the government intends to retain majority control. So by retaining majority control, but having outside investors, the government will, in our view, deliver SOEs that actually expand their economic activities. If one was to look at the dividend stream that comes from assets that are greater than the normalised dividend, it's when special dividends are paid, and when special dividends are paid, it's only actually when those SOEs have embarked in generally overseas activity, it's the case of Meridian with Southern Hydro, and when the sale of those assets have taken place. And as we've seen with Air New Zealand, that's the very reason why that company has operated the way it has, because it had a mixture of ownership. And to be honest, Mr. Speaker, the member was a member of a government that sat around forever and never got up ever one morning and said, despite the fact we've got lots of surpluses, let's buy back Air New Zealand. So if it was such a failed model, maybe the member should have done that rather than getting engaged in a failed and hopeless project down on the Hobsonville base, which has just got wound up.
Question number 2, the Honourable John Boscawen. Order. I've called the